In 1988, in a quiet corner of Greenville, South Carolina, two clocks started running at the very same moment. One of them took less than an hour to destroy a family. The other took more than 30 years to finish. And the strange, almost unbelievable truth of this case is that both clocks were counting down to the same man. Two men in a car on one ordinary Saturday afternoon. One of them the police would name within weeks and never be able to touch. The other they would not identify for 3 decades, and he was hiding in plain sight the entire time. This is the story of how a single discarded cigarette, sitting forgotten in a police storage room, finally made those two clocks meet. Before we start, one small thing. If patient, real, properly researched cases are what you want more of, the subscribe button is how you tell me to keep making them. Now let me take you back to that afternoon. The 8th of October, 1988. A Saturday. Alice Haynsworth Ryan was 80 years old, and she was not a well woman. She was fighting lung cancer. That morning she had gone to a nearby hospital for a chemotherapy treatment. She did not drive herself. Her daughter, Catherine, took her. By early afternoon they were home. Catherine helped her mother inside, got her settled, and then left again to run a few small errands. It was around 2:30. She was gone less than an hour. Hold on to that. Less than 60 minutes. Daughter steps out on a quiet Saturday, leaving her sick, elderly mother safe inside her own home in one of the nicest parts of the city. That is clock number 1, and it is already running out. When Catherine came back, nothing made sense. Her mother's car was gone from the property. It was a distinctive old model, a 1967 Ford, the kind of car half the neighborhood would recognize on sight. One of the doors to the house had been forced, and inside, in the kitchen, Alice Ryan was dead. I am going to keep the details of what happened to her off the screen, because they do not need to be seen or heard. But you have to understand one thing about that kitchen, because it steered the next 30 years of this case in the wrong direction. The violence was far greater than any robbery could possibly require. This was not a quick grab that went wrong. Whoever did this did not simply snatch a set of keys and run. They stayed. And they did far, far more than a thief ever needs to do. And when a crime looks like that, everyone's mind jumps to the same word: personal. That is where the investigation went first. And to understand why that felt so obvious, you have to understand who Alice Ryan was. Because she was not an ordinary victim. Her family, the Haynsworths, had been lawyers in South Carolina for 4 generations. Her father's name still hangs on a respected law firm today. An ancestor had helped found a university. And her nephew was a man named Clement Haynsworth, one of the most prominent federal judges in the American South. In 1969, President Richard Nixon nominated Clement Haynsworth to the Supreme Court of the United States. He very nearly made it. But after a brutal political fight in Washington, the Senate voted him down, 55-45. It was the first time in almost 40 years that the Senate had rejected a Supreme Court nominee, and it made national headlines for weeks. That is the altitude this family lived at. Federal judges, Supreme Court fights, names carved onto law firms and university buildings. Alice's own great-nephew would later become the long-serving mayor of Greenville itself. So put yourself in the shoes of a detective in 1988. A woman from a family like that, attacked with that much fury, inside her own kitchen. Every instinct screams that this is about her. A grudge, a secret, money, inheritance, someone she knew. For a while, that is exactly where the thinking went. And it was completely wrong, because the evidence kept refusing to fit the personal theory. And slowly, the investigators arrived somewhere colder, and in a way far more frightening. Alice Ryan's killer, it seemed, did not care who she was at all. Look at her house through a criminal's eyes for a second. It was large. It plainly belonged to someone with money. And outside the door, several days of newspapers had piled up, uncollected. There is something quietly heartbreaking in that little detail. Those papers had gone uncollected for the most innocent reason in the world. A sick woman and her family, worn down by hospitals and treatments, had simply not brought them in. It was the small domestic debris of illness. But to the wrong eyes, drifting through a wealthy neighborhood looking for a target, that harmless little pile said one thing: nobody is home. And so the theory shifted. Whoever came to that house came for the house, not the woman. They believed it was empty. They forced their way in expecting an easy, vacant mansion. And Alice Ryan, who should have been out, who was only home because she was too sick and too exhausted from chemotherapy to be anywhere else, was sitting inside. She was not the target. She was the catastrophe nobody planned for. If that is true, then the savagery was not hatred at all. It was panic. An intruder who expected empty rooms, and instead came face to face with a woman who could describe him. Which means Alice Ryan may have lost her life for one reason only. She came home from her cancer treatment on the wrong afternoon. The intruder took her car and drove away. And here, clock number 1 nearly stops for good. Because the police were about to get a name. A strong one. And it was going to do them absolutely no good at all. That first clock, the one that ran in 1988, actually moved fast at the start. Within weeks, detectives had a prime suspect. A local man with a long history of breaking into houses. A serial burglar. Exactly the kind of person the crime of opportunity theory pointed straight toward. His name was Lamar Green, and he fit. He fit almost perfectly. But fitting a theory and proving a case are two different things. And in 1988, the science simply did not exist to place a specific man inside that kitchen. There was no quick way to tie him to the scene. The detectives had a strong suspicion and a thin trail. And a suspicion has never once stood up in a courtroom. One of them, a detective named Buddy Burgess, put it plainly years later. "You just do not get that kind of killing every day," he said. There had been a great deal of legwork. They had worked every single angle they could find. They just could not put it together. The randomness of it, in a small southern city that did not see such things, had defeated some very determined men. And then, before they could find a way, the suspect removed himself from the board entirely. A few months after Alice Ryan's death, Lamar Green got into a confrontation with his own mother-in-law. He pointed a gun at his family. She shot him, and he died. The killing was ruled justifiable. She had defended herself and the others in that room. Now think about what that did to the Ryan case. The one man the police most wanted to question was suddenly gone. Forever. No interrogation, no confession, no trial. And with the tools of 1988, no way on earth to prove what they already believed. There is a bitter strangeness in it too. The man suspected of taking Alice Ryan's life did not fall in a police chase or on death row. He died in an ordinary family argument, shot by a relative who had no idea she may have been stopping a killer. She thought she was only saving herself. And with that, clock number 1 stopped. The case went cold. Not because the police had no idea who did it, but because the person they suspected could no longer be arrested, charged, or questioned by anyone alive. Imagine carrying that as a detective. You believe you know the name of the man who killed Alice Ryan, and you know you will never be able to prove it, because he is already in the ground. For nearly 30 years, that is where it all sat. A savage, unsolved killing of a beloved woman from a famous family. And an answer that seemed to have died with the only real suspect. Catherine and the rest of Alice's children grew older. The detectives who first worked it retired, one by one. Greenville changed and grew around that quiet Tudor house. And the case waited. Which brings us to the second clock, the slow one. Because while everyone moved on, something was sitting in the dark, completely untouched, holding the whole answer the entire time. Go back to the day of the killing for a moment. When Alice Ryan's car was taken, it did not go far. It was abandoned nearby and recovered by police. And inside that car were a few small, unremarkable things. Some clothing, a couple of items that would later matter enormously, and, almost beneath notice, a single cigarette end. In 1988, that cigarette meant nothing. It was litter in a stolen car. The officers bagged it, logged it, wrote a number on it, and locked it away with the rest. And then it sat, in an evidence room, in the dark, for 30 years. Nobody could have guessed that this scrap of rubbish would one day be the single most important object in the entire case. Because evidence does not age the way memory does. A witness forgets. A detective retires. A suspect dies. But a sealed bag in a storage room simply waits. And the science was about to catch up to it. In 2017, the Greenville police reopened the case and handed it to a dedicated cold case unit. These are the investigators whose entire job is to return to the files everyone else surrendered on and look at them with modern eyes. And that unit had been on a remarkable run. In the years around this case, they had cracked other decades-old killings, some using new genetic techniques that could trace a person through their own family tree. Cases frozen for a generation were suddenly breaking open, one after another, all because the science had finally arrived. And when they looked again at Alice Ryan's file, they saw what nobody in 1988 could have used. That cigarette. because a cigarette carries a trace of whoever held it to their lips. And by 2018, reading that trace was possible. They sent the old evidence to a crime lab, and the cigarette gave them a name. Now, everyone expecting a neat ending here is about to be surprised, because the name on that cigarette was not the name they had carried for 30 years. It was not Lamar Green. It belonged to a different man, and this one was very much alive. His name was Brian Munns, and like Green, he wore the profile of a career criminal. He had a long and serious record. He had been living barely 2 miles from Alice Ryan's home in 1988. He had been right there, in Greenville, in the weeks around her death, and her stolen car had been dumped in the stretch of ground between her house and his. For a moment, it looked as if the 30-year theory had been wrong from the start, as if the dead burglar had never been the killer, and this living man had done it all. But the DNA, on its own, only proved one single thing. It proved that Brian Munns had been inside Alice Ryan's car. And being in the car is not the same as being in the kitchen. This is the part of the case I find most remarkable, because it is where cutting-edge science hit a wall, and patient, old-fashioned police work had to take over. A DNA match did not solve this. It opened a door. What carried the investigators through it was something far older and far slower. Interviews, dozens and dozens of them, with Munns, with his family, with his friends, with anyone who had ever brushed against this story. The police were careful. They arrested Munns quietly at first, on lesser charges, and deliberately kept it out of the press. That was a strategy. They wanted more time to talk to people before the suspect, and everyone around him understood how close the net had drawn. It was patient, deliberate work. They held the arrest in silence for months, letting the world believe nothing had changed, while behind the scenes they tightened the picture, one conversation at a time. And eventually, one of those conversations became the key to everything. An acquaintance of Munns came forward with something no laboratory could ever produce. This person described details about the killing that Munns himself had apparently let slip over the years. How the intruder had got into the house, what had happened inside, where things were, the timeline of that afternoon. Details that only someone tied to the crime could possibly know. In 2019, the Greenville police called a press conference. More than 30 years after that Saturday, they announced that Brian Munns had been charged in connection with Alice Ryan's death. The chief spoke about the long, painful wait the family had endured. He said the department was elated to finally bring them some measure of closure and some justice for Ms. Ryan. He was in his early 50s by then. An entire adult lifetime had passed. Children had grown up, detectives had retired, and the world had transformed, while the answer sat in a box waiting for the science to reach it. At first, Munns refused to say a word. But then, with a trial looming, he did something that broke the case fully open. He fired his lawyer, and he agreed to talk. And in 2021, he finally told the detectives his version of that day. He said he had been in Alice Ryan's car with another man. And that man, he said, was Lamar Green. The same Lamar Green the police had suspected from the very first weeks. The serial burglar who had died, shot by his mother-in-law, more than 30 years before. Munns insisted that Green was the one who went into the house. That Green was the one who took Alice Ryan's life, and that Green had later tried to sell him the stolen car. Munns denied taking part in the killing, and denied ever setting foot inside the home. And with that, the two clocks finally touched. The name from 1988 and the name from 2018 had been in the same car, on the same afternoon, the whole time. The investigators who suspected Green had been right all along. They had simply been reaching for a man who was already beyond the reach of any court. And the living man, whose careless cigarette had waited 30 years to speak, was the one who could finally close the circle. A prosecutor summed the whole thing up in a single, quiet line. Based on the evidence, he said, this all made sense. But here is where this case refuses to give you the clean, satisfying ending that television trains you to expect. The man believed to have actually taken Alice Ryan's life, Lamar Green, never answered for it. Not for a single day. He had been dead since months after the crime, killed in that family confrontation, long before the science existed to name him. And Brian Munns, the living link, was not convicted of murder in the end. In 2021, he pleaded guilty to a much smaller charge. In legal terms, it is called misprision of a felony. In plain terms, it means knowing about a serious crime and staying silent. That was what the state could prove against the living man. Not that he had killed her, only that he had known, and said nothing, for for over 30 years. His sentence was 4 years, and with the time already counted against him, he walked out. Sit with the arithmetic of that. A savage killing, 33 years of a family waiting, 2 men in a car, and in the end, the one who is said to have done it escaped all of it by dying young, and the one who stayed silent for a generation served almost nothing. That is the resolution, but I do not think it is the point of the story. The point, for me, is the shape of the whole thing. Here was a woman with every advantage a person could hold in that time and place. Name, money, family, standing. And on the one afternoon it mattered, none of it counted for anything, because the danger that came for her had no interest in any of it. She was not killed for who she was. She was killed because she was home, and sick, and standing between 2 men and an easy target they had badly misjudged. The famous name that filled her obituary was the least relevant fact about how she died. And there is one last thing worth holding about those 2 clocks. For 30 years, the people who loved Alice Ryan lived with an open wound and no proof. They had to accept that the man responsible was already gone, and that the truth might stay buried with him forever. They were right to want an answer, even when it seemed impossible, because the answer was never actually lost. It was sitting in a box, on a shelf, in the dark, the entire time, waiting, quietly, for the world to invent a way to hear it. Sometimes the truth does not disappear. It just outlasts everyone's patience, and then, long after they have stopped listening, it finally speaks. So here is what I will leave you with. If Lamar Green had not died months after that afternoon, would the detectives of 1988 have ever proven their case against him with the little they had? Or did his death, in the end, do him one last favor it did not do for Alice Ryan? Tell me what you think below. I read them.